All right, hello everybody. This is a meeting of both the Philosophy Club and the UFO Club here at The Ohio State University. I've given a version of this talk several times. In fact, I think at least once to the Philosophy Club, um, because up until relatively recently, I believed that time travel had various conceptual problems, which meant that kind of regardless of what the physics were, turned out to be, time travel wasn't going to make any sense. And then in relatively recent history, I have a friend, Drew Simmons, who's been pushing on me to reconsider my position. I've been kind of saying I would do this for a little while, but really, I need to give credit to my friend Michael Glosson, who's another philosopher. He's a philosopher of religion, philosopher of science. And he and I had a lengthy Zoom call a couple of months ago where we kind of fleshed out the view that I want to articulate here tonight. So, in as much as this view belongs to any philosophers, it's sort of mine and sort of Michael Glosson's. I will completely spoil two 80s science fiction movies, the original Terminator and the original Back to the Future. Now, I personally believe that both of these movies bear watching many times, so even if you haven't seen it before, I will utterly spoil everything major in the plot, but it is still fun to watch them. So if you haven't watched them, I would still encourage you to do so. I pick these because they are nice versions of two fictitious archetypes with regard to time travel fictions. I'm going to call this looping time travel, and I'm going to call this paradoxical. Looping time travel has a constant timeline. This will be clearer when we go through the two example cases, but the time traveler goes back to the past, and then it turns out that it has always been the case that the time traveler had been in the past. There's only one timeline, it just happens to have a loop in it. Whereas in paradoxical fictions, the timeline changes. This is why it's called paradoxical, because this leads to the well-known grandfather paradox, which, just to get it on the record, is if you were to go back in time and kill your own grandfather before you existed, then there would be a pretty serious problem, because the chain of cause and effect that brought you into existence would then be severed, and then you couldn't go back and kill him. And you understand how this paradox works. This has been well explored in many fictions. So I'm going to start with Terminator, and we're going to go through it very, very quickly, just touching on enough of the key points that I can use it as my example case. So this was a 1984 film, and in the distant future of 1997, an AI became self-aware. This was Skynet, and it decided that humans were a problem. So Judgment Day happened, and it nuked the whole human population. It tried to nuke all the human population. There were human survivors, and so afterwards there was a fairly epic war between robots and humans, and for various reasons, especially the leadership of John Connor, the humans began to have some kind of an advantage. And this freaked Skynet out, so Skynet sent the former governor of California back in time in order to kill John Connor's mom before John Connor was conceived. Now, John finds out that this is happening, so he sends his buddy, who has the most 80s name of all time, Kyle Reese, back in time to protect his mother. Now, there's various guns and action that happen. Kyle protecting Sarah from the Terminator. At one point, they take a break from all the action for a surprisingly sweet and intimate lovemaking scene. Then back in action, unfortunately, Kyle is killed by the Terminator, but thankfully, Sarah eventually kills the Terminator. Shortly thereafter, it becomes clear, right before the credits roll, that Sarah is pregnant and that the child is John Connor. So it has always been the case in this story that John sends his own friend back in time to become his father. Now, there's various philosophical problems that come up for looping time travel, and I'm going to tell you the problems that I care about. Other people might have other problems, but my problems emerge from some of my other philosophical commitments. In particular, this one, I at least want to leave open the possibility of robust agent causation. That is, that it is possible for a person to originate an action in a way that is not entirely determined by the past. This is what many people would colloquially refer to as free will in some robust sense. It's problematic because if you have these loops, it seems to place quite a lot of constraints on what the people in the loops have the freedom to do. So for instance, if Kyle ever told Sarah, hey, I'm from the future, which he did, and she decided, well, I don't really want to hang out with the guy from the future, that's too weird, then they could have gone separate ways, and then John never would, and then the grandfather paradox emerges. So it kind of emerges, the grandfather paradox can emerge anywhere in between the loop if anybody chooses something differently than they should do. This makes sense? It also just seems to generally imply determinism. It seems to imply that if you run things from one point in the clock, you will always get the same outcome. So independent of agent causation, you might have worries about determinism because, for instance, we know determinism is false. The laws of physics are not deterministic, they're probabilistic, and so it doesn't actually make any sense that if you start the clock from the same point, we would expect it to come out to the same outcome. At least this is, again, my philosophical commitment. So I'm inclined to think that determinism, we've seen enough from quantum mechanics that we should just reject determinism. This also leads to the reason I call this looping time travel is it creates these closed causal loops. That is, there are things which are partially causing themselves. In this case, it's John Connor, right? It is John Connor's decision to send Kyle back that makes Kyle his father. So John, in a way, creates himself. And John's youthful existence depends on his later existence. His later existence depends on his youthful existence. And you see this problem, right? When we talk about logic, we generally don't like circular arguments. Why? Because circular arguments are unsatisfying. They don't actually explain anything, right? The easiest proof for God's existence goes like this. Premise 1, God exists. Conclusion, God exists. Totally valid, not very interesting, right? Because you haven't actually introduced any new information that might persuade somebody. Similarly here, John Connor exists. How come? Because John Connor exists. This is not a very satisfying answer. So you end up with this, some of the events being unexplained. They can't trace their origins back, for instance, to the Big Bang or anything of that sort. Now, in order to get more technical, I'm going to need a couple of terms, and I want to develop a little bit of a visual vocabulary so that I can show you some fancy graphs and stuff. So I want to talk about a moment as essentially a connector between a fixed actual past and a somewhat open potential future. In a deterministic moment, there is only one past. That's relatively straightforward. But there's also only one future. There's a 100% probability, given the actuality of the past, that potentiality will be actualized next. You already know that I'm not a determinist, at least not in general. So I'm going to be talking about probabilistic moments. I'm just going to use a kind of coin flip probability for the kind of purposes of visualization, a 50-50 probability. But of course, the probabilities don't have to be 50-50. They could be 20-80. There don't have to be just two options. There could be many, right? If you were to roll a die, for instance, then you would have any number of outcomes that could come out of that. Whoops, no, that's fine. So we also can chain these things together. So if we have a whole bunch of deterministic events, we're going to get a straight line. Now that means that at any point in the line, if you knew enough about that line and the transformation rules from one moment to another, you could predict anything that would happen after that. You could also retrodict everything that had happened prior to that, right? This is not the case if you have a probabilistic outcome. Probabilistic outcomes accumulate very, very quickly, exponentially. So, however many outcomes you get, they're going to, go up generation over generation quite rapidly. It's also possible, of course, to have mixed cases where some chains of events, some parts of the chain of event are determined and others are probabilistic, right? I do want to note that if I actually keep tracking the probabilities the whole time, it'll go nuts. So I will sometimes change it to this little diamond thing, which just means there's a whole lot of options down that direction, not only one. Yeah? Okay, so now we're going to do Back to the Future. And I'm going to go again relatively quickly through it. And it's going to get really messy because I want to at least indicate the kind of accumulation of possibilities over time. So once upon a time, George and Elaine fell in love, got married, and had Marty. Marty grew up to be a cool teenager with a cool girlfriend. His family, however, was relatively uncool. His siblings were not very successful, all things considered. And his dad, especially, was still being bullied by Biff, who was his high school bully and is now his boss. Fortunately, because he has this sort of weak male character in his life, he has this other adult male friend named Doc Brown. And he's an eccentric, crazy person who believes strange things about the universe. And he has built a time machine out of a DeLorean. Now, the way he did this, there's a thing inside of it called a flux capacitor, and it requires a decent amount of energy. In particular, it needs some plutonium. And plutonium, as you might know, is difficult to come by. So Doc Brown does a deal with some Libyan terrorists, telling them that he's going to build them a nuclear bomb. And they give him the plutonium, and instead of building the bomb, he makes a time machine out of a sports car, like you do. Now, the terrorists find out about this, and then they kill him. Marty, unfortunately, is there when this happens, so he jumps in the sports car to get away from the terrorists, and he gets it up to speed, and this is now how the time travel begins. Now, you can see here this accumulation of all of these various possibilities. I want to make sure you realize that anytime you have an indeterministic, probabilistic series of events, there's just going to be lots and lots and lots of possibilities that accumulate. Many, many, many branches that could have happened. Now I'm going to simplify it so that we can see things a little bit better. So he leaves this point and he goes back to the past. However, this is not a looping story. This is one of these paradoxical stories. So there was a first time that 1955 happened. And in the first time, there was no Marty. Now there is a series of events happening in 1955 in which there is a Marty. So we need to keep track of both sets of events because both sets of events are going to be relevant for how this works out. So we're going to track this other series of events using blue. Marty goes back. He meets his mom. His mom thinks he's hot. So she stops paying attention to the man who is supposed to be Marty's father. She now has a crush on Marty, who she calls Calvin Klein because of the name on his underwear. Anyways, and she doesn't pay attention to George. A lot happens in this movie. As I say, it's worth watching. There is a very intense and traumatizing sexual assault scene in this movie in which Biff, the bully, begins to molest Elaine. Now, fortunately for Elaine, George shows up and punches Biff in the face, which means that they do get to go to the dance together, which is where they originally had their first kiss. So everything looks like it's going to be okay, but the kiss is taking a little too long, so Marty's hand starts to fade. Fortunately, George, with his newfound sense of self-confidence, kisses Elaine. Marty's hand is back. He plays Johnny Be Good, therefore allowing a white person to invent rock and roll. Okay. Marty, after this performance, goes to a local cafe and he writes a note to Doc Brown. Hey, Doc, the terrorists are going to kill you. Don't open this until 1985. Gives it to Doc Brown, hops in the time machine and goes Back to the Future. That's the name of the movie. Okay. So when he gets back to the future, this is technically not quite the same series of events, right? Because remember, there was no Marty coming from the past the first time, right? But these are supposed to correlate with each other. And I just skipped over a bunch of them here because everything happened in between. And you understand. Okay. Yep. So when Marty gets there, he sees Doc get shot. He sees himself watch Doc get shot, get in the time machine, and go back to the past. He then walks up to Doc Brown. Doc Brown said, yeah, I said I wasn't going to read the letter, but I did, and I wore a bulletproof vest. So everything's fine. Not only is everything fine, everything's better because this confident version of George now helps lead to this new family culture where siblings are much cooler and successful than they were before. Now, George is super cool and hip, And Elaine is totally into him, and they're both confident old people. And Biff's now just a loser who, polishes George's car for him. And in addition to this, perhaps the most important thing is now Marty has a really great truck in addition to his beautiful girlfriend. Roll credits. We're okay? All right. So how is this supposed to work out exactly? The problem here is that we have two distinct sets of events that we have to keep track of. We have to keep track of them because they are both relevant to what's happening in the story. Marty, his experience all the way through is an experience of remembering everything that happened in the yellow version of the timeline. He knows, for instance, that George and Elaine have to meet at the dance, otherwise they won't get together, etc. So he's trying to make the things happen which he knows are supposed to happen. Now, he knows all of that because of his experiences in yellow timeline. But he's acting in blue timeline, so we're going to have to explain how we have these two sets of events and how they relate to each other. The ways... The two ways that I used to use to explain this, I do think work out with various caveats: parallel worlds and branching timelines. What I used to say is time travel is either possible or it's possible, but not really time travel. These are going to count as possible, but not really time travel, right? So imagine the parallel worlds option. There have always been, in some sense, two whole worlds, two whole sets of events. It's just that in the yellow timeline and the blue timeline, they were exactly the same moment for moment up until this moment when Marty arrives from yellow timeline. Does this make sense? So the thing about this kind of a view is that everybody over here is a different person than everybody over there. In philosophy speak, we would talk about these as their counterparts. In MCU speak, we would talk about these as their variants. I like the word variant. We'll go with variants. Yeah? So Marty leaves yellow timeline, but presumably yellow timeline continues, and he goes to a different parallel world, which is just strikingly similar to the world that he came from, and he carries out a series of events over there, and that series of events continues. He doesn't really time travel, he timeline jumps. Make sense? Okay. Now, there's a problem with this, which is, oh my word, how many universes do you need in order to pull this off? Because presumably, given my assumptions about indeterminism and agent causation and stuff like that, Doc Brown, when he punched in the date into the time machine before Marty jumped into it, could have picked any date, right? So every date needs to have a corresponding parallel world. Worse than that, they need to be at various degrees of completion, because when Marty jumps into it, it's not fully formed yet. He is part of its forming. So it's going to be like, you're going to need a lot of universes to pull this off. And I don't know about you, but I do, despite some people's claims, still like Occam's razor. So let's not have too many universes unnecessarily. We could tidy this up by just branching off of the other universe. So there's a timeline, Marty jumps back, and somehow this creates a parallel world, which is at this moment, molecule for molecule, identical to everything in that one. Now, this makes a little more sense, a little more tidy philosophically speaking, although you do have to wonder how that amount of plutonium pushing a car from over there to over here creates an entire universe. That seems implausible, but that's fine. We won't worry about that because all we really care about is the story. So let me give you some narrative story problems. Given that we're not actually going back to the past, we're just jumping to a parallel world or creating a parallel world, there's no particular reason why Blue Elaine can't prefer Yellow Marty to Blue George, because Blue Elaine is not Yellow Marty's mom. She's Yellow Marty's mom's counterpart. Yeah. So disrupting the relationship between Blue Elaine and Blue George doesn't lead to the non-existence of Yellow Marty. Yellow Elaine and Yellow George already made Yellow Marty in the yellow timeline, no big deal. So yeah, it would be weird if Marty decided to hook up with Blue Elaine, but he totally could. They probably shouldn't have any children because of the genetics problem, but technically not his mom's. Yeah. Here's another problem. Why is Blue Marty so similar to Yellow Marty? I don't want you to have to think about this too much, but almost all of you came into existence because your parents had sex one time. And when that happened, there were about 100 to 300 million sperm involved in that event, and one of them won the race. And when that one won the race, that's when your biological entity began, and I'm not going to get into the personhood issues, right? So your genetic construction came out of the union of that 1 in 300 million sperm and your mother's egg, right? Well, that's an incredibly fragile event. If anything slightly different happened, like it happened just 5 minutes later, the same sperm winning the race would be extremely improbable. Yeah? So one of the things that this view has to explain is despite everything that changes in this timeline relative to that timeline, Marty still gets born. Not only Marty, but both of his siblings still get born. So all of George's newfound confidence and capacity to overcome bullies and all these kinds of things somehow still results in the exact same 3 conceptions. This is puzzling and in need of some kind of an explanation. No explanation obviously forthcoming in a parallel worlds world or a branching timeline, either one of these. There's the problem that Doc Brown, the Doc Brown that Marty knows, is still dead. He just died in yellow timeline. Then Marty went and met Blue Doc Brown and saved Blue Doc Brown from the Blue Libyan terrorists, right? But the Doc Brown who's been a friend of Marty's through all of his hard high school years, he's still dead. And in fact, Marty seems like he just abandoned his whole family, right? This is actually not Marty's girlfriend. This is Marty's variant's girlfriend, or Marty's girlfriend's variant, or in this case, all of the above. And his family is presumably very worried about how Doc Brown got murdered at the mall by Libyan terrorists. And immediately after that, Marty left, which means they probably called the authorities, who then tracked down all this plutonium. And this probably leads to a pretty serious global political situation between the United States and Libya, because now we have evidence that a US citizen was involved trying to build a nuclear bomb for Libya. And yeah, these guys are probably pretty concerned about what's going on with Marty and what Doc Brown got him into. And these are things that would be a fun thing to explore in another movie. Oh dear. Okay. Yes? Great. Now, both of these, the parallel and the branching timelines, have all of the problems just described. They are philosophically consistent. That is, they don't generate grandfather paradoxes for the obvious reason that it doesn't matter if you get Blue George and Blue Elaine separated from each other, because that doesn't actually result in Yellow Marty's non-existence. You don't run into all these problems of closed causal loops and unexplained events and all that kind of stuff. So most of the philosophical problems disappear if you do this. It is inconsistent with the narratives as told. We're supposed to care that Marty saved Doc, right? We're supposed to care that Marty's parents are better off than they were before. And that does fall apart if you have a story like this. It does require other whole universes, at least one if you're branching, and a lot if you're going parallel. It's not really time travel, as I said before. It's something more like timeline jumping or parallel world jumping, something like that. All right, so here's why we're hanging out here tonight. Because my friend Michael Glosson and I chatted, and I came to the conclusion that we might have another option. All we have to do is introduce a second dimension of time. So we're going to call, right, we have 3 dimensions of space that we're aware of. This one, and this one. We have one dimension of time that we're aware of. This one to this one to this one to this one, right? So what we're going to do to talk about hypertime is I'm going to use a little graph here. The x-axis of the graph is going to represent time, not hypertime, regular time, the kind of time that we're used to going through. I will then put little screenshots over each moment in time, which indicates what's happening at that moment in time. The time that we will go through together momentarily, going through each slide, is hypertime. We are moving from this moment in hypertime to this one. As we progress through hypertime, more events are being added to various timelines. Does this make sense? Okay, so here we go, moving through the timeline, and then something interesting happens. So we're going to keep track of this as something like a parallel world, but I actually want to suggest that it isn't a parallel world. The way we're going to think about this is at a different moment in hypertime. After that moment in time gets added to that timeline, the next moment in hypertime, we go back and revisit that moment in time and we change it. In particular, we put Marty into it. Then this will cause the next event, but there's something like temporal inertia going on. There's some resistance for this event to be too different from that one. This is what explains the syncing. We're actually sort of imaginatively taking that event and transforming it into this one. So we're going to do the minimum number of changes in order to pull that off, right? So we're just going to keep going through. Eventually, Marty is going to jump over these events. We could just put him in hypertemporal stasis for a minute. He doesn't need to go anywhere yet. We will allow these other events to emerge until he pops back in again. Yes? He will then move here. Now, by the time he gets here and he sees himself go back in time, he actually is seeing himself go back in time. Now, this is going to get complicated because up until here, Marty still remembers everything happening in yellow timeline. But ultimately, we want to reconcile all of this over different moments in hypertime, which is why I'm calling this hypertime syncing. So now what we really want to happen is for this thing that goes back to be the blue version of Marty. Yeah? Now, that means that the psychological experience of Marty, as it goes through here, should be syncing itself up with the blue timeline version of the events. He should stop remembering loser versions of his parents, and he should only remember confident, cool versions of his parents, right? We could imagine this process taking some hypertime, right? As this process completes, the need for the yellow timeline disappears until eventually enough moments of hypertime have elapsed. This Marty no longer remembers anything from the yellow timeline. All of the events here are consistent according to their blue timeline versions, and then we only have one timeline. One timeline with a loop in it, which means it looks a lot like Terminator. Yeah? All right. So all we had to do to pull this off was introduce another dimension. We went through it step by step, but we can, of course, graph this. We can have multiple moments in hypertime. Each moment in hypertime will be different hypertime states, which relate to different temporal states, perhaps over multiple forked timelines or whatever. So far, so good. Because this is Philosophy Club, I know that somebody will say, well, then couldn't you have hypertime? And the answer, of course, is yes, you could have hypertime. That would be another temporal dimension that tracks changes in hypertime, and then you could have hypertime travelers, and then you could create hypertime loops. But I don't see any particular narrative reason to do so. One dimension of hypertime should do it, so we're going to just stick with one. The benefit of a view like this is it can now solve a number of weird temporally related problems. So imagine, for instance, that we're dealing with one moment, and for whatever reason, there is some moment in the future which is fixed. This could happen for any number of reasons, narratively speaking, right? Let's say, for instance, that this is Marty's conception. Marty's conception, for whatever reason, given the way that timeline syncing happens, hypertime syncing happens, Marty's conception is really quite important. So there will be some kind of a pressure which generates this higher probability of getting from there to there. This represents a whole bundle of possibilities in between the two events. All of these are paths to the fixed point. You could also do this, by the way. One of the reasons I'm thinking about this stuff, that I've always been thinking about this stuff, is because it's relevant to issues that I care about in the philosophy of religion, in particular foreknowledge and providence problems. How could God know the future and still have us have robust agent causal free will, for instance? Let's imagine that what fixes that is God saw it, or it's important to divine providence that that thing happens. But yet, nonetheless, God values agent causal free will, agent causal indeterminist free will. How could such providential stuff work out? Well, let me show you how it might work. So at each of these points, these are agent causal choice points, so the agent can choose whatever they want. So let's say that this agent chooses that, and then that, and then that. So as this happens, we're getting this kind of timeline, or this kind of set of events that kind of becomes increasingly important in order to get to the fixed point. Now, you could imagine all kinds of things happening here, like psychological pressure begins to build, right? You just start to get this hunch. I don't know, I should go over there, right? That kind of thing could happen. But let's say, because we're being agent causal indeterminists, let's say that despite whatever nudging and stuff happens, the agent chooses a dead branch. No problem. Retrocausation occurs. We just reset the thing and we start over again. You just go back far enough. At the next moment in hypertime, you just go revisit the problematic moment at the beginning of whatever this chain of cause and effect was, and we allow the agent to then proceed through until the choices emerge freely, and then we get where we want, agent causally chosen. You see how this works? It might also work for weird things like quantum entanglement. So imagine, for instance, that we have some kind of a particle emitter. It emits two particles, but they are entangled with each other. We'll just use yellow to represent spin up, and we'll use blue to represent spin down. So what is this? What is the particle? What's the spin of this? It is neither spin up nor spin down. Let's just assume that it's a 50-50 superposition of spin up, spin down. This is also a 50-50 superposition of spin up, spin down. The particles go away from each other until this one gets observed as yellow. That causes a hypertemporal retrocausation, which then creates the whole thing to propagate back from the beginning. So you actually don't have to have spooky action at a distance. You can have even spookier action over hypertime. What a benefit! No problem. All right. Benefits of hypertime syncing. It allows for time travel with agent causation. It resolves the grandfather paradox. It reconciles agent causation with fixed points. It explains the origin of apparently closed causal loops because they're not actually closed. They only look closed if you look at them through time, but they're actually open across hypertime, right? So you could imagine, for instance, another hypertemporal loop of what happened in the original Terminator, right? John Connor wasn't the general. It was somebody else. Zach Smith. Zach Smith becomes the general. Zach's like, oh no, the Terminator is going to go back and kill my mom. I got to send my buddy Kyle Reese. Kyle Reese goes back, doesn't really pay attention to Zach's mom, falls for Sarah, conceives John. John grows up, becomes the general, but because of this hypertemporal preservation pressure, sends Kyle back again, time loop created. But it's not actually closed. You see how this works? It might be able to help handle quantum superpositions, which are weird. And it only requires one universe, because there's only one timeline. You're just changing parts of it over moments of hypertime. Now, I don't want to suggest that this view has no flaws. It's a very peculiar view, because I just introduced something that it's not clear we have any reason to believe. which is this extra temporal dimension that I'm calling hypertime. But it's also going to generate some personal identity issues. Now, I genuinely, truly don't have any idea how to resolve personal identity issues. Personal identity is a very complicated set of philosophical problems. I'm just going to model it using distinct individuals in this case, but I will use the individuals represented by a soul. I genuinely don't know if there are souls. We're just going to pretend that there are. I assume that you could translate this into other kinds of views, but the soul view is kind of a simple one to work with. So the first way we're going to do this is where every party in all relevant timelines has distinct souls. If we do the parallel worlds view, we're going to need two people. We're going to focus here on Elaine. So we'll have yellow Elaine and blue Elaine, yellow Elaine's soul and blue Elaine's soul. And they will just move through the different moments in their respective worlds. This is kind of what you would expect in a parallel worlds view, right? If there's an Elaine all the way through this timeline, she needs her own identity. We're just going to represent that using a soul. So far, so good. This one seems pretty straightforward. Although, as we remember, there's all these other weird costs about parallel worlds that we might not really like. What about branching timelines? All right, well, this is a bit of a problem because when the timeline gets generated, a new person has to get created. This person is then synced up with all of the past states of that person. So this person is a little bit weird. She comes into existence partially formed as an adult. Now, again, there's nothing philosophically inconsistent about that. It's just sort of weird. What about hypertime syncing? This might do better, although as we'll see, it does have some peculiar features. What we're going to do is we're going to have a soul that exists outside of any singular temporal line, right? So this soul watches what happens in the original version of the events, or not just watches, participates in the original version of the events. And then it goes through a kind of peculiar moment, because what just happened to it is when Marty went back in time, this soul forgot what it was like to be a full-grown adult and went back to being what it was like as a teenager, right? So it loses all of its adult maturity and it goes back to acting like a teenage soul. This is peculiar, although again, not impossible. We could imagine that perhaps the confusion, the kind of hyper psychological state of this being is part of what explains how the syncing happens or something. Maybe that works out somehow. Yeah. We could, as I said, account for all of the personal identity problems using distinct individual identities, which we're using talking about souls. Here's another way you could think about this. We could use simulation theory. All of this across all of the different timelines could be happening inside of a big computer. I do take simulation theory seriously, not because I think we are actually inside of a computer, but because I think there's reasons for thinking this way, modeling it this way as a model for something else, which I'm going to show you in a moment. But let's just see how this works, right? In essence, there is only the computer. In the computer, there's a bunch of abstract objects which have variables in them which are set to various parameters. And then when this happens, it just creates another set of parameters. It just copies the array and then starts, you understand how this works if you're a computer nerd, right? And you say, well, what is an individual? An individual is just a sub-process inside of the computer process that is the whole thing. This is how a simulation theory would work out. All of your personal identity problems get solved because we're all just sub-processes of the master control program. Yeah, Tron reference for those of you who are paying attention. Okay. I'm more interested, by the way, if you're going to talk about this kind of view, in the thing that we're working around operating inside of, not being a computer. That actually only moves all the problems, all the philosophical problems. Here's why the universe is so cool and fine-tuned, because we're all running inside of a computer. Okay, where did the computer come from? You're just going to have to explain all the complexity and design kind of things in the world above. So that's not going to work out very well. Maybe we can do a general purpose solution where instead of using a computer, we use the divine mind. Whatever that means. I don't know. I really don't know. Now, what I have done when I teach philosophy of religion, I've developed a little framework for talking about how different concepts of the divine might relate to different versions of the cosmos. The cosmos is green and the divine is yellow. Not drawn to scale, of course, and the divine doesn't have a color. Anyways, you understand. There are two versions of these: endotheism, which means that the cosmos is a subset of the divine, and exotheism, which means that the cosmos is at least somehow distinct from the divine. So pantheism would be complete overlap between the cosmos of the divine. The cosmos and the divine are the same thing. Yeah. You could have panentheism, where the cosmos is a proper subset of the divine. There is more to the divine than the cosmos, but everything in the cosmos is divine, right? Both of these versions of endotheism. You could also have a view, which is presumably the view of most Abrahamic theists on the street, that there is a divine and then the world, the cosmos, is separate from the divine, yeah? And then just for philosophical completion, you could have partial overlap, right? That would mean there are some things that are outside the divine and some things that overlap with the divine. Okay. Let's be endotheists for a minute. Now, I like endotheism in part because I like to hang out with Asian philosophy, and views like Hinduism, for instance, are endotheistic. So everything that happens in the world is some kind of an aspect of the divine. Either the divine and the world are equal. That would be a kind of monistic view, or they're partially overlap, or not, sorry, or the cosmos is a proper subset of the divine. That would be this kind of panentheistic, qualified non-dual kind of a view. How does that work then? Well, there's actually only one divine mind, Atman/Brahman, and it just has different aspects through the different timelines. It basically works. You could model it using the computer model. There's just no computer. It's just like the computer is only standing in for the divine mind. So what am I? A little spark of the divine mind traveling through the yellow timeline. If we imagine a branching timeline, then a little spark of the divine mind copies what was happening in the other one and then happens in the blue timeline. Now you don't have to have all these extra universes and stuff. It's just the divine mind attending to itself in different ways. You can do this if you want to have your kind of Abrahamic style theism where each of us has our own distinct souls, no problem. When Marty goes back to the past, what happens to Elaine? God just creates an Elaine soul duplicate, and that's not that hard for God to do. You could also do this with distinct hypertemporal souls. That would work out fine. Also, God could just create hypertemporal souls. God would be hypertemporal, and we would also be hypertemporal. We would just not normally experience things hypertemporally. We normally experience them temporally. One more fun thing that we might be able to do something with, the fine-tuning of the universe. Those of you who study philosophy of religion know that there is a peculiar feature of the world in which we live, which is that there is this story that emerges using especially gravity. Once upon a time, there was a big bang. After that, there's a bunch of hydrogen. The hydrogen is not evenly distributed. Some regions are denser than others. Those dense regions become more dense because of gravity's operation. Some of them get really hot and bothered and they become stars. Some of those stars are exactly the right kind of density to go supernova. That's where you get all the heavy elements like carbon, and you have to have an element at least as heavy as carbon in order to make anything interesting. Otherwise, you just get, did you ever use those things, Tinker Toys, those little wooden things? And if you just have a wooden circle with one hole in it, all you can do is stick them together. If all you have is hydrogen, you can only make H2, and you can't make anything interesting out of H2. But if you have carbon, you can do all of organic chemistry, and now you can have data containing molecules like deoxyribonucleic acid and stuff. And that's only possible if you have a story like this. So far, so good? Great. Now, it turns out that the strength of gravity being approximately what it is a critical part of that working out. If you make gravity a little bit weaker than that, then you don't get the kind of stellar formulations and supernovas and all that kind of stuff that you need to make cool molecules out of something like carbon. You just get a big diffuse hydrogen cloud. Nothing interesting happens. If you turn it up too high, it doesn't expand and develop like that. It'll just expand, it'll explode and then collapse again. Yeah? How fragile is this? I'm just pulling this from a kind of a pop science guy named Ethan Siegel, who, by the way, is an atheist, but does believe in this fine-tuning problem. And he points out this particular especially fragile moment in the history of the universe. Because of Einstein's theory of relativity, we know that there's a mass-energy equivalent which means, very peculiarly, you can measure energy in grams. You can measure energy density in grams by doing grams per cubic centimeter. So about 1 nanosecond after the Big Bang, this is the matter energy density of the universe. How much do you have to mess it up in order to screw up the fine-tuning problem? Only by a factor of 0.2. So that's really fragile, right? It has to be basically exactly what it is in the world that we live in. Why is this the case? Now, this is one of the big reasons that people give for believing in God. The reason that the universe is fine-tuned is because God wanted it to be fine-tuned, and so God set the gravitational constant and various other kinds of things. God set the matter energy density at the right amount in order to make sure that we got cool atoms to build cool molecules, to build cool things like us, agent causal monkeys. I know we're not monkeys. We're apes because we don't have tails. How might this work out? You could just do it over hypertime. Now, there is this kind of hypothesis that people went with for a long time before we understood modern physics, before especially our buddy Edwin Hubble figured out that the universe was expanding. The kind of standard thing to believe about the universe was that it was infinitely old. It was just cycling through infinitely variant states infinitely. There was nothing interesting to explain, was the hypothesis, although interesting philosophy is done about infinitely long timelines and whether they need explanations. Don't worry about that too much. Now, when we got to Hubble and friends, we realized the universe was expanding. Well, if it's expanding, then we run it backwards, it's contracting, then it had to have a beginning point 13.7 billion years ago, and we started calling that thing the Big Bang. So far, so good. Could there have been a sequence of Big Bangs? Yes, but having a sequence would require, again, quite a lot of fine-tuning. You'd have to have a Big Bang which would expand at just the right rate, so that it would contract at just the right rate, so that it would bounce again the other way around, right? And if what you need to do in order to explain fine-tuning is not have things be fine-tuned like that, because what you're trying to do is explain the fine-tuning, right? Then what you actually need is a bunch of cycles that are different, but you see the problem will emerge, right? If it's too strong, it'll just go forever and it won't come back down again. If it comes back down again, it won't bounce again. So you can't have them sequential, but you could have them hypersequential. So you could have a whole universe that expands and goes to heat death. And when it gets to heat death, it retrocauses and starts over again. And then it goes back here. It happens to be fine-tuned. We just have the dumb luck to be existing in this hypertemporal moment of reality. You could pull that off. You don't necessarily need God, although if you like God, you could put God in a different place. You see how this works? Benefits of the view. Okay. Hypertime is a flexible concept that promises to be useful across many domains. Not only could we use it to do things like explain the peculiarities of our time travel fictions and model all time travel fictions without grandfather paradoxes or closed causal loops, something I've been trying to do my whole adult life. But in addition to that, we might be able to do things like deal with what's going on with quantum entanglement. We could perhaps even do things like explain. We could perhaps even explain fine-tuning. Maybe we could do this in various ways. We could do this as a divine mind theory. We could all be inside the divine mind. We could all be external to the divine mind, created by the divine mind. It's quite flexible. You can do a lot of cool things with it. If hypertime is real, then time travel of many kinds should in fact be possible, despite my many years of saying that it wasn't. What do we want? Time travel. When do we want it? It's irrelevant. So yeah, I'll see you whenever. Thank you.